The reality of this conversation is, sex is not binary and immutable. Trans people do not have a secret agenda. That is a conspiracy. Trans people are disproportionately affected by hate crime. They are disproportionately affected by discrimination. That includes in the workplace, access to housing, public spaces. The science supports trans people. The science says that sex is not binary, is not immutable. Gender-critical people who come from that perspective are misusing science, misinterpreting science deliberately. Finally, how you personally feel about gender identity should not impact the human rights of others. Hello, lovely people. My name is Emma. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you are new. Today we are going to be talking about the gender-critical movement, formerly known as TERFs. Don't worry, we're going to get into some terminology before we begin so that you can catch up. Just to warn you before we begin, I fully anticipate a lot of hate on this particular video. Transphobia, homophobia, sexism, stuff like that seems to have increased lately on my channel. Anyway, maybe that's just natural as the viewership has increased. All I'm going to say is, don't feed the trolls. If you are watching this as somebody who considers yourself gender critical, or you just follow the science, you just think it's about facts and this whole thing is very silly, I really encourage you to watch this whole video. Please to check out the resources that I'm going to link down below, and I'll put this into chapters as well. We're going to go through some definitions. We're going to talk a bit about what this gender critical movement is very briefly. We're going to talk about the science. We're going to talk about the social issues, and we're essentially going to debunk the gender critical movement. I can't wait to have an inbox full of people telling me I'm just a sad little boy trying to be a girl, whatever it is today. The thing is, I have fun, silly videos planned before I come out with these things. If it wasn't for the bigotry in the world, we could just skip these videos and enjoy the stupid things. But hey, subscribe to the channel and then you won't miss the stupid funny videos where we look at people asking questions about Ouija boards and stuff on Quora. So, gender critical. If you've not heard this term before, you might be more familiar with TERF. TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminism. I think that gender critical has taken over as a term. TERF is what was sort of ascribed to that group. Gender critical is the name they've sort of given themselves. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that gender critical is expansive to include non-feminists. The gender critical movement, I'll discuss this more shortly, but the gender critical movement has been repeatedly, more recently, aligning themselves with people who are anti-women's rights for the sake of having a comrade in arms against trans people. Just look at all these so-called feminists supporting Matt Walsh's What is a Woman documentary. That's a great example of that. They have, in theory, completely different contradictory ideologies, but they align themselves for the sake of promoting this transphobic viewpoint. The other reason I think that gender critical has taken off as another term is because, like we see with online scams, once a group name or a company name has a certain amount of negativity associated with it, it benefits them to change the name and move on. Because then when you Google it, when you hear it in conversation, you don't have that association with the negative thing. The history is sort of painted away with that magical tool. So essentially gender critical and TERF is more or less the same thing here, but gender critical encompasses people who wouldn't want to identify as feminist. So it's kind of more open in that way. What do they believe? What do they espouse? The core of it is this. They purport that sex is binary and immutable. That you cannot change your sex, you are either male or female as you are assigned at birth. They believe that is what the science supports and that's the end of the discussion. Trans people are mistaken, unwell. Their ideas of what causes trans people are different from person to person, but they essentially believe that there are men and women, and that is that. Their campaigning then is largely around segregation, I want to say. You largely see them campaigning against things like gender-neutral bathrooms, or campaigning for trans women to be barred from women's bathrooms, things like that. Same goes with gyms, communal changing rooms of whatever kind. They've also campaigned against discrimination laws for trans people, to protect trans people from transphobic hate crimes, to bar trans people from, say, women's shelters, things like that. And then outside of the actual activism or campaigning, largely what you see is people using this faux science-based ideology to be transphobic. to hurt trans people, to out trans people. They've done a lot of doxing, stalking, harassing. It's a bit like people who are, say, biblically against same-sex marriage, but largely they're using that view to be homophobic, as an excuse to be homophobic. It's the same kind of thing. So the main thing that comes up in these discussions is science. It's about the science. The gender-critical people say trans people are ignoring the science. The majority of people, scientists, trans people, allies, normal people, say that the science supports trans people. Once again, I am going to recommend Willow the Wendigo. She has a fantastic series of videos on being trans. It's very accessible if you just don't know very much and you want to learn. It's a long series. It discusses the science, the history. It's really, really good. So I'm going to drop that down below and recommend that that's a good starting point if you just want to learn more about what being trans means, what the science is, the history, etc. Here's a key thing. For the longest time, trans people have been saying, we're not interested in the science of sex. We are changing our gender. The majority of trans activists that I've seen over the last year or so have said, we believe that gender and sex are different things and we just want you to respect our gender. So in that respect, we shouldn't even need to have the science portion of the discussion. But since it is so important to the gender critical movement, we're gonna have it anyway. So here's the key question. Is sex binary? Sex is not as simple as your chromosomes, your genitalia, your gametes. It just isn't. If it was, intersex people wouldn't exist. Unfortunately, intersex people have been so invisible for so long that doesn't help a lot of people understand the conversation better. I've had some discussions with various people, notably on YouTube, Savvy Writes Books, where we've talked about the Matt Walsh people and the what is a woman argument. Somebody like Matt Walsh pointing out that we cannot simply define woman is actually an accurate representation of the science and not the state of the woke media. This is from an article on Sapiens that I will again link down below. Please do check out all of the sources if you're interested. It will help explain far better than I can trying to fit it all into 10 minutes on my own. Biologically, there is no simple dichotomy between female and male. Genitals, hormone levels, and chromosomes are not reliable determinants of sex, because, for example, there are people with XY chromosomes who have female characteristics, there are people with ambiguous genitalia, there are women with testosterone outside the typical female range. Numerous studies have found that the differences between adult men and women are overhyped and largely influenced by the dynamics of biology and culture. This is a simple conclusion from this article that I really like. The data-driven bottom line is that man/woman and masculine/feminine are neither biological terms nor rooted exclusively in biology. The lack of an explicit binary is especially evident in humans, given the complex neurobiologies, life histories, and morphological dynamics in our species. There are many successfully biologically diverse ways to be human, and millions of people embody this diversity. We know that your chromosomes alone do not dictate your biology. You can have XX chromosomes and present with male genitalia, and vice versa. Let us go back to the beginning. Now I'm using some stuff sourced from Scientific American. Again, this will be down below. A newly fertilized embryo initially develops without any indication of its sex. At around 5 weeks, a group of cells clump together to form the bipotential primordium. These cells are neither male nor female, but have the potential to turn into testes, ovaries, or neither. After the primordium forms, SRY, a gene on the Y chromosome discovered in 1990, might be activated. It's still not fully understood, but SRY plays a role in pushing the primordium towards male genitalia. SRY is not a simple on-off switch, it's a precisely timed start signal, the first chord of the male gonad symphony. You can thank Scientific American for that beautiful sentiment. A group of cells must all express SRY at the right time. Without that first chord, the embryo will play a different symphony, female gonads, or something in between. SRY activation initiates the process of male sex differentiation, but during adulthood, you have genes like DMRT1 and FOXL2 that maintain certain sexual characteristics during adulthood. If those genes stop functioning, gonads can change and exhibit the characteristics of the opposite sex. Without these players constantly active, certain components of your biological sex can change. That is a really important point to note in this discussion, because the gender critical or the TERF movement hinges on the idea that sex is immutable. You begin your life with this sex and that is it. And that is not science. That is not science. Sex is not a binary. It's not a 1 or 0. It's a combination of characteristics, and your sex characteristics can change. That is the science. So that's SRY, DMRT1 and FOXL2. Then we have secondary sex characteristics. Penis, vagina, appearance, behaviour. These come from genes interacting, your hormones, your environment. Half a century of empirical research has repeatedly challenged the idea that brain biology is simply XY equals male brain or XX equals female brain. In other words, there is no such thing as the male brain or the female brain. That's not to say there are no observable differences. Certain brain characteristics can be sexually dimorphic, observable average differences across males and females. Here Scientific American uses one of the most famous examples of sexual dimorphism in the brain, the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area, or SDNPOA. This tiny brain area with a disproportionately sized name is slightly larger in males than females, but it's unclear if that size difference indicates differently wired SDNPOAs in males versus females, or if, as with the bipotential primordium, the same wiring is functionally weighted towards opposite ends of a spectrum. Throw in the observation that the SDNPOA in gay men is closer to that of straight females than straight males, and the idea of the male brain falls apart. Here's another example of sexual dimorphism. The hormone vasopressin is dimorphic but linked to both behavioural differences and similarities across sex. Thanks to trans people participating in research, we have more and more evidence by the day that the human brain is not sexed in that overly simplistic way. You've probably heard of some of these studies, right? Some properties like brain volume and connectivity, trans people possessed values both in between those of typical cisgender males and females, both before and after transitioning. Another study found that for certain brain regions, trans individuals appeared similar to cis individuals with the same identity. In the same study, researchers found specific areas of the brain where trans people seemed closer to people who were assigned the same sex at birth. Other researchers found that trans people have unique structural differences from cis individuals. The long and short of all that is, it's complicated. There is no neat and tidy list of what makes a person male or female. It is a combination of characteristics. We're still in the beginnings of learning how the brain affects your sex and your gender. And that's without even getting into hormones, which we're going to talk about now. Hormones are used by gender-critical people and transphobes, I've seen them in my comments section, to indicate whether a person is male or female. More testosterone, male. More estrogen, female. During infancy and prepubescence, these hormones sit in a bipotential range, with no marked sex differences. Through puberty, these hormones become weighted to a certain end of a spectrum. But in developed adults, estrogen and proestrogen levels are on average similar between males and non-pregnant females. While testosterone exhibits the largest difference between adult males and females, heritability studies have found that genetics, X versus Y, only explains about 56% of an individual's testosterone, suggesting many other influences on hormones. Furthermore, measurements of sex hormone levels in any one individual vary wildly across the range of average values, regardless of how close or spread apart you take the measurements. The binary sex model not only insufficiently predicts the presence of hormones, but is useless in describing factors that influence them. There are intersex women, there are cis women who produce what we would consider too much testosterone, who produce an above average amount of testosterone or not enough estrogen and take medication for that. They take hormone therapy. Something else that gender critical people don't like to acknowledge is that social and environmental factors can influence your physiology. Environmental, social, and behavioural factors also influence hormones in both males and females. Progesterone changes in response to typically male-coded social situations that involve dominance and competition. Estrogen, typically linked to feminine-coded behaviour, also plays a role in masculine-coded dominance, power, social scenarios. Though testosterone levels are different between males and females on average, many external factors can change these levels, such as whether or not a person is raising a child. Differing testosterone levels in both men and women can predict certain parenting behaviours. Even the content of a sexual fantasy can change testosterone levels. The fact is, behaviour and environment, like cultural gender norms and expectations, influence sex-related hormones and the biology of the body and the brain itself. Sex is not binary and immutable. It just isn't. There are many more examples of sexual dimorphism. I will link more articles and some books down below that I think would be super useful if you are interested in learning more. As the Scientific American notes, trans people definitely exist, and they are incredibly helpful in helping us understand these sex characteristics. So that's the science side of things. The gender-critical proposition of what sex is and how it functions is incorrect. It is misinformation, it is anti-science. Let's talk about the social side. There's a media kit produced by GLAAD in 2017 that I'm going to link down below. It's very good. It is a media kit. It's a guide for journalists on accurate reporting, non-discrimination. So it debunks a lot of misinformation on trans people. I would advise you to read the whole thing because it is very interesting. Here's a key part. Multiple studies show that transgender people face heightened discrimination that leads to disproportionately high levels of poverty, unemployment, homelessness, inadequate medical care, incarceration, and violence. Such has been the case with many a minority group throughout history. The reality is not that trans people have an agenda that is somehow targeting the media, influencing children. Trans people are trying to survive, trying to exist. Ideally, they're trying to get trans-affirming healthcare. That is an extremely difficult thing for them to do as well. For the most part, trans people are just trying to live in the world peacefully with equal rights and freedoms to everyone else. At the moment, they are not able to do that because they are disproportionately targeted by hate. If you are somebody who comes from the perspective of a TERF, you consider yourself a feminist or a humanist, or you're interested in simply protecting people's rights, the discrimination that trans people face is far, far more serious and widespread than any potential harm that trans people could do. The idea of a group of people, because of their way they identify, causing harm is something that I hope you can understand has been repeated again throughout history against various minorities to scapegoat an issue. It happens to Jewish people, to people of colour. It happens to queer people. GLAAD references this as well. I think this is an important fact. Those who oppose non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ plus people often reduce non-discrimination protections to a conversation about public restrooms. The reality is non-discrimination laws affect so much more than public toilets. It's a bit like when we get into conversations about sport, which I'll mention in a minute, but when you talk about sport, public bathrooms, whatever, they really are far down the list of things that are important to the actual group of people we're talking about. The main thing in non-discrimination laws that we want is for people to be treated equal and fairly, to have equal opportunity and access to employment, to have that employment protected so they can't be discriminated against based on their gender, to have access to housing, public spaces. I will link some articles down below to people who have lost their jobs, been discriminated against because of being transgender. Those are the real issues. It's astounding how much of the conversation we've managed to make about toilets. And the reality of that conversation is, by banning gender-neutral toilets, which is one of the goals of the gender-critical movement, by banning those, first of all, back to longer wait lines for the women's toilets. Second of all, it's not just trans people that you are hurting. It is trans people. You're also hurting non-binary people. You're hurting cis people who don't conform to the typical gender stereotypes. You're hurting parents, because typically fathers, male parents, find it much harder to access baby-changing facilities, things like that. That in turn reinforces stereotypes about the type of things that mothers should be doing all the time. Again, I will leave an article for you down below. I'm just going to say this very simply because I've said this before actually. There is no link, there is absolutely no link between inclusive bathroom policies and bathroom safety. No link. It doesn't exist. Then there are related sex-based areas that gender-critical people talk about protecting, right? Women's refuges, lesbian bars. These are two that I've seen talked about a lot. Actually, I will also link a Cat Black video down below. She did a call-in show about how lesbians felt about trans women in lesbian bars. I think she explains a lot of the problems with a lot of people's suggestions and views in a very considerate and conscientious way. I really like Cat Black, actually. You should, obviously, she's a lot more famous and well-known than me, but you should subscribe to her anyway if you're not. So much of the fear around trans people in women's spaces. And I think it's interesting, and it's a subject of investigation for another day maybe, as to why trans men are so invisible in this discussion, and it's all about trans women. So much of the fear around trans women in women's spaces is not a fear of trans women, it is a fear of men. It is a fear, and this is, again, something that came up in the topic of lesbian-only spaces. There were many lesbians in that discussion who essentially said they are tired of having their spaces, their women-only spaces, infiltrated by men. That is still a man who is committing that act, who is infiltrating that space. What you are doing by making that problem trans women's problem is you're hurting other women. You're letting the men at fault get off scot-free and putting the blame on other women. That's definitely not feminist. The question in all of these scenarios is, how do you regulate this? I have seen gender-critical people stipulate that if you are trans, and or if you do not conform to gender stereotypes, you should have to take your birth certificate, or a copy of your birth certificate, to things like public restrooms. A, where are we going to get all these toilet bouncers that are doing this job of checking people's fucking birth certificates? B, I'm not taking my birth certificate to a toilet. C, that's going to slow the process of going to the toilet down a huge amount. The main thing, and this is what comes up in the lesbian bar conversation a lot, right? The main thing is that what you end up with is either you check the gender ID of every single person that enters this space, which is not practical. Everybody acknowledges that that's not practical. It's not a possibility, let's be real. The realistic alternative that most gender-critical people sort of promote is basically based on what the person guarding the door considers to be feminine or masculine enough. It ends up being based on a completely subjective view of what it means to be a man or a woman, which is gender-based and stereotype-based, and we know that the science doesn't correlate with that. We've talked about that already. You're just going to end up restricting a lot of cis women from women's spaces because they don't look feminine enough to you. There is no legitimate way to enforce what the gender-critical people want. There's no way to do it. The reality of the social issues that gender-critical people have with trans people, the trans movement, the agenda, whatever it is they want to call it, the problem they have relies on reinforcing gender stereotypes. And remember, a lot of these people consider themselves feminists, consider themselves fighting for equality, fighting for women's rights, yet this entire ideology, this entire movement hinges on old-fashioned gender stereotypes. It doesn't conform to the science. It doesn't conform to the philosophy or the sociology, because, once again, if you're interested in equal rights and protecting people from discrimination, trans people are the ones being heavily discriminated against. They are the ones that are really disproportionately affected by violence. Anyone who claims to be coming from a place of support and caring about people and just trying to protect people from harm should be more concerned with that harm. To continue to be transphobic in the wake of that is to dehumanize trans people. That's the only way I can see these people being genuinely caring and considerate and worried about people's rights, but not caring about the discrimination that trans people face. Let's talk about sports for a second, just because I mentioned it earlier. This is another conversation that has dominated the transphobic sphere, the gender-critical sphere online. I believe it is a very, very far down the list of important issues. I believe it is a scapegoat used to distract from the reality that trans people are being targeted disproportionately by hate crimes. Because that is far, far more important than who can play what sport, in my opinion. Granted, it is a very important topic to athletes and to sports lovers, which I acknowledge I am most assuredly neither, so I know that this conversation is important to some people. The discussion of how we should better categorise certain sports is ongoing and complicated. Different sports have tried to do it in different ways. They tried to do it by the gender you were assigned at birth, by hormone levels. Categorising by hormone levels doesn't work because you eliminate cis women who have high levels of testosterone, things like that. Because sex is more complicated than that simple binary, categorizing sport and figuring out which advantages are acceptable, which are within reasonable limits, because when you talk about advantage and disadvantage in sport, let's remember that that exists on a spectrum as well. We acknowledge that there are, in running, there are men with really long legs and men with really short legs. That is an acceptable advantage and disadvantage. If you have extremely long legs and a very strong build, you have the perfect build for running, lovely long legs, you're not barred from competing in that category. Even though it's accepted that you have a certain biological advantage, it's just an advantage that we can't really help for the sake of categorization. We accept that it's within the limits of, what we consider okay. In many sports, left-handed people have an advantage. We consider that within the realms of the acceptable. So it's not about having a harsh dichotomy of male and female, or having these extreme categories of what is fair and any advantage means that that is not fair. It means looking at the advantages and disadvantages of certain characteristics, some that are typically associated with men, some that are typically associated with women, and saying what is acceptable, what is fair, what is within the realms of average differences that we consider okay. Do we need to redefine the categories altogether? Should things be done more by weight in certain cases? Blah, blah, blah. It's complicated. It is not a case of you're assigned male at birth, you go here. If you're assigned female at birth, you go here. It just doesn't work like that. This side of discussions, the Ben Shapiro facts don't care about your feelings group are that, despite the fact that Ben Shapiro himself uses emotion constantly, especially in his books, to promote a certain narrative, it's fine. Do as I say, not as I do. They come with this approach of facts first, and nothing else matters. The facts and traditions and beliefs first excuse for things is why it was illegal to be homosexual. We know that gender-critical people are wrong on the science anyway. Should it matter? I don't think so. Even if they were correct, right? Say they were correct, and it turned out, we did some new studies, and it turns out everything we've known until now is wrong, and sex is actually binary. There are these characteristics, there are these characteristics, that's it. Does that mean that trans people who have a different gender identity than the sex they were assigned at birth, does that mean they shouldn't have equal rights and opportunities? Does that mean there shouldn't be laws in place to protect them from hate crimes and discrimination? No, of course not. I've covered a lot of channels on YouTube, weird online organizations, Instagram accounts that come from a biblical perspective that says that women are lesser than men and therefore should not have equal rights. A lot of them come from a, well, the science says perspective. The science says that men on average are stronger. The tradition says that men are the heads of the household. Does that mean that women should not have equal rights? Access to the same opportunities? No, of course it doesn't. The same goes for trans people. It shouldn't matter. The science is something that we are in the process of learning and discovering, and like I said, trans people are an incredibly important part of helping us understand sex and gender and how our brains function and how our hormone levels change based on our environment and social situations. That should be an aside, because the reality is we know that trans people exist because they're here and they're telling us they're here, so we should do everything we can to prevent them being hurt by hate crimes, to prevent them from being discriminated against. That's it. It should be that simple. TERFs and gender-critical people will try to pretend that there is some alternative agenda. Again, a lot of this comes from a specific type of religious bigotry. Not all of it, but a lot of it. They imagine that this is either something satanic, this is something I've seen people say on YouTube a lot, by the way, that it's something satanic, this is simply the influence of the devil, and that is why we need to stop them. Or they say that trans people are trying to affect the children, that trans people are trying to encourage children to be trans. None of them have come up with a good explanation as to why, and I've never seen any trans rights activist want children to be anything other than comfortable and safe being themselves and have access to the appropriate healthcare, mental health systems, etc. To summarise these points in the neatest way I can, there is no reason based on facts, evidence, or science to discriminate against trans people. If you know the science, If you learn the history of trans people, if you spend a little time doing some research and learn that trans people did not pop into existence 20 years ago, they have existed throughout human history, all across the world. If you accept those things, if you research into the trans agenda conspiracy and learn that it is only something that is perpetuated by transphobes and bigots with an agenda of their own, and that there is no evidence to support anything of this kind, you accept that that's a conspiracy, there's nothing left. There's just nothing left. Maybe you personally think trans people are just silly, doing it for attention. You can't understand it because it doesn't relate to you in any way. You are 100% the gender you were assigned at birth. Nothing else makes sense to you, whether that's because of your religious beliefs or otherwise. There is still no reason for you not to stand behind those people's right to live safely. There is no reason, especially if you come from a religious background, there is no reason for you not to be out there defending trans people's rights to exist safely, to try and lower the rate of discrimination that trans people face. The reality of this conversation is, sex is not binary and immutable. Trans people do not have a secret agenda. That is a conspiracy. Trans people are disproportionately affected by hate crime. They are disproportionately affected by discrimination. That includes in the workplace, access to housing, public spaces. The science supports trans people. The science says that sex is not binary, is not immutable. Gender-critical people who come from that perspective are misusing science, misinterpreting science deliberately. Finally, how you personally feel about gender identity should not impact the human rights of others. It just shouldn't. Everyone on this planet should have the same access to safety, the same access to opportunities, the same human rights, the same right to not be discriminated against. We should be, and we can be, so far past these old gender stereotypes that this shouldn't be a conversation that we're having. Whatever your feelings, and if you are still gender critical at this point, it is based on feelings and not facts. That is the truth, because we know that the science doesn't support that worldview. Whatever your feelings are, everyone should have the right to exist safely. That means we need laws in place to protect people from hate crimes. And if you are campaigning against those, you are actively campaigning to hurt people. It doesn't matter what gender you think they are, you're campaigning to hurt them. I think that's fucked up. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry. I know this is going to be long. I'm going to stick a whole bunch of sources down below. My throat hurts and the Patreon list is so long, I am going to just show you lovelies on the screen today. I hope that's okay. I fully expect a higher proportion of transphobia and bigotry in the comments than usual. If anyone is being particularly heinous, report them. Don't feed the trolls. It's what they want. That said, I would love to hear your thoughts down below. I think this is a really important conversation, especially right now. Finally, I hope you have a very lovely week, and I will see you really soon.